Today's headline is Knights of the Gun Who Made History in Early West. It says, the killing of outlaw James McKinney in a Chinese joss house at Bakersfield, California, has served to recall some of the plucky deeds of famous frontier marshals who never hesitated to enter any place or to confront any odds when striving to make an arrest. McKinney, who shot Charles Blakey, known as the cowboy pianist at Kingman, Arizona, was a desperado of the worst type. He was known to be a sure shot and quick with the gun. Consequently, after his brutal and unprovoked murder of Blakey, when McKinney turned up at Bakersfield, the town marshal knew that he was facing death as soon as he got within range of McKinney's gun. But McKinney's fire from the Joss house was returned with such good effect that the outlaw was killed, though not until he had slain Deputy W.E. Tibbets and mortally wounded City Marshal T.J. Packard of the opposing party. Deeds like this were not uncommon in the West a few years ago. In fact, when a man accepted the Marshal Star of Service badge, he knew pretty well that he was taking long chances in a game with death, particularly if he happened to be in a community that was favored with many men of the bad type. Towns like Dodge City and Hays City, Kansas, Tombstone, Arizona, and Leadville, Colorado, were the bright particular gathering places of the Knights of the Revolver, and the history of the bad men and of the takers of bad men is so mingled that one is at a loss to know today where to find the line that marks the desperado from the upholder of the law. In fact, it was a common custom in the West to select as sheriff a man who had made a record as a killer. Many a bad man has accepted the badge of marshal or sheriff and has made a notable record in office. Seemingly, there was a certain pride in assuming the badge of authority and going among the lawless element as a representative of law and order, though perhaps the same lawless element would have recognized the marshal as a bright and leading light only a short time before. Dodge City and Hays City, Kansas, though now the most peaceful towns in the world, have had a number of marshals with double records. Dodge City in particular, which was the center of the buffalo hunters, horse stealers, cowboys, soldiers, and adventurers of all sorts a generation ago, points with pride to its gunfighters, whose records are those of lawbreakers as well as law enforcers. As good an example of the bad men turned marshal as one can point out is Wild Bill Hickok, whose fame will endure as long as that of his cousin, Buffalo Bill. Wild Bill was known as a fighter in the various cities from Dodge to Denver and from Tombstone to Deadwood. He began his fighting career in the Civil War, one of the most famous of his exploits being the spiking of the guns of Fort Pillow. The federal fleet did not care to ascend the Missouri under the guns of the fort. Wild Bill was dropped into the river, having around his neck a string of light files with which to spike the cannon. He strangled the sentry, climbed inside the fort, and forced the files into the priming holes of the cannon. When he was spiking the last gun, he was discovered. He escaped over the wall, swam away, notified the fleet, and the Federals came up the river past the helpless fort. Killed 8 men. When Wild Bill was living on the Big Blue near Manhattan, Kansas, 8 pro-slavery men visited his cabin with the intention of killing him. He was at the spring when they came, but he shot 2 of them dead, got into the house, and shot 4 more before his pistol was empty. The 2 remaining men sprang upon him, but he killed them both with his knife. Such feats made Wild Bill famous throughout the entire West, and there was a rivalry among the lively cities of the frontier to secure him as a marshal. He was one of the most picturesque figures of the old days. His hair was long, black, and curling. His mustache gave a fierce look to his face, and his keen eyes made him a man who would be picked out as something extraordinary in any crowd. He had the shoulders of a Hercules and the waist of a woman, and his physical strength was phenomenal. His chief characteristic, however, was the quickness with which he could draw his revolvers. He never took aim, but the guns were discharged as soon as they were drawn from their resting places. This fact doubtless saved him from death 100 times. He always depended on the fraction of a second advantage which his own quickness gave him over his opponent. In Hays City, 2 soldiers undertook to kill Wild Bill, and they crept on him from behind. One of them knocked him down with the butt of a revolver. As he laid on the ground, half stunned, Wild Bill instinctively drew his terrible guns, and both soldiers were killed before they could complete their work. At another time, a noted gambler sought to kill Wild Bill. Hickok not only shot the gambler dead, but killed one of the man's friends who was running to assist him. Then he paid the funeral expenses of both men. A refractory alderman of Hays City, whose vote was needed, swore that not even Wild Bill could take him to the council chamber. Bill walked up to the man, threw him on his shoulders, and carried the alderman into the council chamber like a sack of flour. As a marshal, Wild Bill made a wonderful record, and usually his mere appearance was enough to make a lawbreaker submit to arrest. This hero of 100 battles, like nearly all other men who had depended on the revolver, met an ignominious death in a saloon at Deadwood, being shot in the back by an Irishman with whom he had had an altercation. Bat Masterson, who is known today in sporting circles from coast to coast, was one of the coolest fighters in the days when the revolver was the last resort in argument. Today, Masterson is an inoffensive, blue-eyed, plump-haired chap who can write a rattling good newspaper article, who is soft of speech, and whose long divorce from any scene of violence has even led some people into the error of thinking that his record as a frontiersman terror was imaginary. But any well-posted Western man knows that Bat Masterson has fought his way out of many death traps and has triumphed over many close shooting enemies merely through his cool head and steady hand. Masterson in 1877, though a mere boy at the time, was sheriff of Ford County, Kansas, and his brother Ed, a handsome youth, was marshal of Dodge City. While Ed was attempting to disarm some cowboys before they entered a dance hall, he was shot through the lungs. Bat killed 2 of the cowboys and chased the other ignominiously out of town. This gave Bat a widespread reputation as a gunfighter, although he had gained local prominence some time before by his skill as a buffalo hunter and an Indian fighter. Bat was concerned in nearly all the exciting incidents that made Dodge City one of the liveliest spots on the map. Usually he was enforcing law and order. However, and later on in Leadville, he did not less heroic work. In the palmy days of the gunfighter, Texas Street, Dodge City, was known as Hell with the Lid Off. A railroad bisected the street, giving it the appearance of a double avenue. On both sides of the railroad were saloons and dance halls, with a slight minority of general stores. The motley collection of men who visited Dodge City at all hours of the day and night, buffalo hunters, scouts, soldiers, Indians, gamblers, and the riffraff that invariably sends out such a headquarters for crime, thronged Texas Street and the other avenues of commerce. Naturally, the maintenance of order at Dodge City was no light matter, and the election of a marshal meant a great deal more than the appointment of a police captain in any city today. Probably the best marshal Dodge City ever had was Patrick Shugrue. This little horseshoer never found it necessary to kill a man, although he arrested many notorious gunfighters, some of them being taken under circumstances that were decidedly humiliating to themselves. It was Shugrue's rule to seek out his man and calmly say, "You may consider yourself under arrest." Apparently these words had a hypnotic effect, for it was seldom that there was any attempt at resistance. On one occasion, it is related that a bad man sent word to Shugrue to come and take him. Shugrue obligingly went to the bad man's place of business, and as he opened the door, a revolver was discharged almost in his face. With lightning quickness, Shugrue knocked the muzzle of the weapon upwards, but the powder burned his face and hand. The marshal quickly had the would-be assassin on the floor, the bad man naturally thinking his days were numbered. But instead of discharging his revolver, which was held at the coward's head, Shugrue simply said, "I ought to kill you, but you may consider yourself under arrest." Shugrue began his career shoeing horses for the United States government at Fort Dodge. Soon he opened a blacksmith shop of his own, and in 1878 was elected constable. He arrested a few horse thieves, who were numerous on the border at that time, and then announced his candidacy for the marshalship. The city administration was against him, and it was rumored that on election day, a great number of deputies inimical to Shugrue would see that the little blacksmith's friends would not get a chance to put their man in office. But Shugrue telegraphed Bat Masterson and Wyatt Earp, and on election morning, they were on hand with the simple announcement that Pat Shugrue was to get a fair show. The appearance of these 2 noted gunfighters on the scene changed the plan of the city administration, and the anti-Shugrue deputies did not materialize. The blacksmith carried every precinct and began the operations which gained him fame as the gentlest captor of the very worst badmen in the United States. It is said that Shugrue never lost a prisoner, which is the more remarkable from the fact that he never found it necessary to shoot one. His sole object was to do his duty in accordance with the law, and the wildest inhabitant of Dodge City never forgot this fact, and consequently never failed to respect the peace officer as a brave man among brave men. Ben Daniels, who came into the public eye a short time ago on account of the controversy over his appointment as United States Marshal of Arizona, was a prominent figure at Dodge City in its wildest days. Daniel was every inch a gunfighter, and he had made a big reputation as a killer, when the people, following a happy custom, decided that it would be better to have such a man as a peace officer than a peace destroyer. Daniel's career at Dodge City gained him such fame as a gunplayer that when the new and noisy gold camp of Cripple Creek began to loom up, Sheriff Bowers of El Paso County, Colorado, sent for this Kansas revolver expert. Bob Taylor was brought up from Indian Territory at the same time, and Kid Wallach and Grant and Lem Crumley were also imported, and all were made deputy sheriffs at the time of the Great Cripple Creek Strike in 1893. Grant Crumley, only a short time ago, shot and killed Sam Strong, the millionaire owner of the Strong Mine, about which much of the tragedy of the Great Strike was acted. Daniels showed his nerve during the strike in a way that recalled the Dodge City days. The strikers, headed by veterans of the labor wars of the Coeur d'Alenes, under command of the mysterious General Johnson and Jack Smith, were entrenched behind earthworks on Bull Hill. They had cannon, and their position was considered impregnable, but Daniels one morning organized a company of mounted deputies and started out with the avowed purpose of capturing and hanging General Johnson. Just at this time, the National Guard, under command of Davis H. Waite of Bloody Bridles fame, flung itself between Daniels and the strikers and prevented a conflict which would have been nothing short of a battle on a large scale. Paid death penalty. Daniels not only showed his nerve at Cripple Creek, but he made it warm for Blackjack, the famous New Mexican bandit who was the terror of the Southwest for many years. One of Blackjack's men clipped off a piece of Daniels' ear with a pistol bullet, but the bandit himself paid the forfeit of death for his temerity in facing the Dodge City gunfighter. When the Spanish-American War broke out, Daniels enlisted in Roosevelt's Rough Riders and went through the campaign in a manner that gained him the personal commendation of President Roosevelt. Luke Short, another member of the Dodge City Circle, made his name famous in the days of Masterson, Daniels, etc., by the prominent part he took in the festivities along Texas Street. Every gunfighter has his peculiarities of style, like every other individual who depends on his skill and quickness in living up to his reputation. Short, unlike Dave Maverick of Dodge City, was an open and fearless fighter. Maverick, who was undersized and who shuffled along the street with his hat pulled down over his eyes, had a trick of throwing up his hands and whining and protesting when some fellow bad man got the drop on him. Invariably, Maverick's opponent would neglect to fire, and his pistol arm would drop at his side. Instantly, Maverick's own gun would leap forth, and the coroner of Dodge City would have another case to attend to. Luke Short never adopted this style of fighting. He participated in some of the hottest fights in the history of Kansas, both in Hays City and Dodge City, but no man could ever say that Short took the mean advantage. His prowess as a gunfighter gained him appointment as sheriff and marshal, and like other bad men who rose to these official positions, he made a good officer, taking pride in his ability to bring the worst outlaw to justice. Probably the gentlest of all the border characters of the stirring days of Dodge City was J.B. Almohandro, better known as Texas Jack. Almohandro was a protege of Buffalo Bill. He dressed much after the style of Cody and was much in demand among buffalo hunters as a guide. He was one of the most skilled Indian fighters that ever blazed a trail through the wilderness, and he was one of the first white men to penetrate Yellowstone Park, entering that great place of natural wonders soon after Jim Bridger made his famous trips into the Yellowstone. Texas Jack never provoked a quarrel, but when in one, he was known as anything but a quitter. He was called upon in his day to bring many men to justice, but like Pat Shugrue, he seldom found it necessary to make a gunplay. Texas Jack was taken up by the Papyrus Club of Boston on a trip east in his early days and was made much of at the Hub. His picturesque frontier regalia as he walked down the main streets of Boston attracted no little attention, and the frontiersman liked the notoriety so much that he remained for some time in Boston, becoming a local celebrity. Unlike most of the Knights of the Pistol, Texas Jack did not die with his boots on. Pulmonary troubles carried off this gentle character, and his grave near Leadville, Colorado, is often visited today by men who knew and admired him in times when really gentle men were few. Probably the worst bad man who ever gave trouble to the marshals of the Southwest were King Fisher and the Thompson brothers, Ben and Bill. Fisher was at the head of a gang of cattle rustlers and was known as a bad man generally. He was a bully through and through, fierce and assertive. When he entered a barroom, his eyes circled round to see who he could browbeat. On one occasion, Fisher so thoroughly bullied Bill Longley, a bad man of no small reputation, that Longley never again cocked his head over one eye and put on his bad man's swagger. Fisher not only made him show the white feather, but took from him his revolver and shoved it across the bar to pay for the drinks for the crowd. Fisher had a sense of humor, which wasn't evidenced when he put up a signboard at the forks of a public road. The signpost read, "This is King Fisher's road. Better take the other." Needless to say, most people took the other road, even though it was farther around. Fisher was the humorist who shot a bald-headed man at Austin, Texas, giving as his reason that he wanted to see if the bullet would glance from the shiny pate of his victim. A grim humorist. Ben Thompson was another humorist, and he and his brother Bill played many wild pranks with their revolvers, to the terror of the populace and to the undoing of many marshals. It was Ben Thompson who broke up a cattleman's banquet at Austin by shooting every plate off the table and breaking the neck off every bottle, while not a cattleman dared shoot in return. The wholesome fear of Thompson can be realized when it's known that the desperado rode into a county courtroom on his Mustang with a six-shooter in either hand and pleasantly informed judge and jury that he would like to see any coyote in the crowd when nerve enough to take him. Nobody moved, and Thompson rode from the room as debonair as you please, despite the fact that there were several unserved warrants out for him on charges of murder. Thompson met a dramatic death. He was persuaded to visit the Palace Theater at San Antonio, Texas. As he entered his seat in the front row of the balcony, a volley of rifle shots rang out. 30 men in the parquet fired by signal, and the desperado was riddled with bullets. King Fisher, who was with Thompson, was killed outright, and Thompson tumbled from the balcony into the pit, mortally wounded. Before the desperado died, however, he drew a gun and killed 2 men, one of them being the man who had prevailed upon him to come to the theater. Thompson's brother, Bill, quickly heard the news, rallied his followers, and swept down on the theater. A barricade of well-armed men under cover kept them back with repeating rifles. The cowpunchers poured into town to avenge the death of King Fisher. The militia was called out, and for 6 weeks San Antonio was under martial law. At last the cowboys retired, leaving the deaths of Thompson and King Fisher unavenged. It was seldom, however, that any bad man arose who could not be corralled by the nervy marshals of the West, and if worst came to worst, the bad man himself could usually be persuaded to don the star of authority and act in the interests of the law. In the case of nearly every bad man, death has been a violent one and has been brought about by treachery. Many excellent marshals, too, have met death by foul play, and it's one of the remarkable features of nearly every gunfighter's career that the fairer and more open his own work, the more treacherous means his enemies employed to get him out of the way. Among modern marshals, probably the best known are Captain Burton W. Mossman and Captain Thomas Renning at the head of the Arizona Rangers. These Rangers have gathered in most of the bad men in Arizona in recent years, and it's seldom now that they have to go out and get a gunfighter. Probably in a few years, there will be no more demand for their services, and then the reign of the bad man in the West will be over, and the reign of the plucky shore-shooting marshal will also be at an end. This story came from the great state of Georgia, being reported in the sunny South of September 23rd, 1904. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.